Guantanamo Bay, often referred to simply as Gitmo, has been one of the most controversial and debated locations in the modern world. Its strategic position on the southeastern tip of Cuba has made it both a symbol of American military power and a lightning rod for accusations of human rights abuses and violations of international law. Located within a 45-square-mile naval base, Guantanamo Bay has been the subject of intense scrutiny for over a century, particularly after the events of September 11, 2001. The early history of Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay's history begins long before the establishment of the U.S. naval base. The area was originally inhabited by indigenous groups, such as the Taino people, who lived on the island of Cuba for centuries before the arrival of European explorers. Christopher Columbus's arrival in the New World in 1492 marked the beginning of European colonization in the Americas, and over the next few hundred years, Cuba became a Spanish colony. In the late 19th century, Cuba was embroiled in a fierce struggle for independence from Spain. The Cuban War of Independence, 1895 to 1898, culminated in the Spanish-American War, which was triggered by the explosion of the U.S. battleship Maine in Havana Harbor in 1898. Following Spain's defeat, Cuba was liberated but placed under American military occupation as part of the Treaty of Paris, 1898, which ended the Spanish-American War. The United States, through the Platt Amendment of 1901, obtained a long-term lease on Guantanamo Bay, which provided the U.S. with a naval coaling station. This arrangement was ostensibly meant to ensure the security of the region and protect American interests, but it also solidified U.S. control over the bay and the surrounding area. The lease, which was renewed in 1934 and is still in effect today, grants the U.S. the right to use Guantanamo Bay as a naval base, but it is controversial due to its nature as a permanent lease, with little recourse for the Cuban government to revoke it. This legal situation has been a source of ongoing tension between the U.S. and Cuba. The U.S. naval base and its military role. The naval base at Guantanamo Bay was first used as a strategic military post in the early 20th century, but it became more prominent during World War II and the Cold War. Throughout the 20th century, the base played a significant role in U.S. military operations, particularly in the context of the Cuban Revolution of 1959, which brought Fidel Castro to power and turned Cuba into a communist state. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 further emphasized Guantanamo's strategic importance, as the U.S. sought to assert its dominance in the Caribbean and prevent Soviet influence from spreading. Despite its military relevance, Guantanamo Bay was largely overshadowed by other major U.S. bases around the world. It was only after the events of September 11, 2001, that Guantanamo Bay would become a focal point in global politics. Guantanamo Bay after 9/11, the War on Terror and the prison. The most significant chapter in the history of Guantanamo Bay began after the September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks in the United States. In the wake of the attacks, the U.S. launched its War on Terror, which involved military interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as a series of security measures aimed at preventing future attacks. One of the most controversial aspects of the War on Terror was the creation of detention centers for suspected terrorists. In January 2002, the U.S. military opened a detention facility at Guantanamo Bay to house individuals detained during operations in Afghanistan and elsewhere. The decision to use Guantanamo Bay as a site for holding prisoners was driven by a variety of factors, including its remote location, which made it difficult for detainees to communicate with the outside world, and its legal ambiguity, as the base was technically on Cuban soil but under U.S. control. The Guantanamo Bay detention camp was initially used to hold individuals suspected of being involved in terrorism, including members of Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and other militant groups. The detainees were often held without trial, leading to widespread criticism from human rights organizations and the international community. The conditions at Guantanamo Bay were harsh, with reports of overcrowding, poor sanitation, and limited access to legal representation. One of the most contentious aspects of Guantanamo Bay was the use of enhanced interrogation techniques, a euphemism for torture, which included waterboarding, stress positions, and sleep deprivation. These methods were used on detainees to extract information, but they were condemned as violations of international law, including the United Nations Convention Against Torture, to which the United States is a signatory. The detention facility at Guantanamo Bay became emblematic of the U.S. government's approach to counter-terrorism, which prioritized national security over individual rights. The use of torture, indefinite detention without trial, and the denial of due process led to widespread outrage, both domestically and internationally. Many critics argued that Guantanamo Bay represented a fundamental breach of American democratic values, while others saw it as a necessary evil in the fight against terrorism. Key facts about Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay is located on the southeastern tip of Cuba, covering an area of 45 square miles. The U.S. naval base occupies a small portion of this land, with the remainder being Cuban territory. The detention facility at Guantanamo Bay has held a variety of prisoners, including suspected members of Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and other jihadist groups. At its peak, over 700 detainees were held at the prison. As of 2023, the number of detainees has dwindled to around 30, many of whom have been cleared for release but remain detained due to bureaucratic or political hurdles. Over the years, there have been repeated calls for the closure of the Guantanamo Bay detention camp. President Barack Obama made efforts to close the facility during his presidency, but was unable to fully achieve this goal due to political opposition. President Donald Trump reversed Obama's policies and sought to keep the prison open, while President Joe Biden has indicated his intention to close the facility but has made limited progress in that direction. Rumors and conspiracy theories. Guantanamo Bay has been the subject of numerous rumors, conspiracy theories, and allegations that have added to its mystique and controversy. Some of the most prominent rumors and unsubstantiated claims include: there have been persistent rumors that Guantanamo Bay is not just a detention center but also a site for secret CIA black sites where prisoners are subjected to even more extreme interrogation techniques. These rumors suggest that Guantanamo Bay is part of a larger network of covert U.S. prisons used to detain and interrogate individuals without oversight. Another rumor that has circulated about Guantanamo Bay is that detainees are subjected to mind control experiments, similar to those allegedly conducted by the CIA during the MK-Ultra program. These claims are largely based on speculation and have never been substantiated by credible evidence. Many former detainees have alleged that they were subjected to physical and psychological abuse, including threats of death, sexual humiliation, and forced confessions. While some of these accounts have been corroborated by human rights organizations and legal experts, others remain unverified and have become part of the broader mythology surrounding Guantanamo Bay. The ongoing debate and the future of Guantanamo Bay. The fate of Guantanamo Bay remains uncertain, as debates over its future continue to play out in both U.S. politics and the international community. Proponents of keeping the facility open argue that it is necessary for national security and that it serves as a deterrent to terrorism. However, critics argue that it has become a symbol of injustice and that its continued existence undermines American values and the rule of law. The legal battles surrounding Guantanamo Bay are far from over. As of 2024, several detainees remain imprisoned, many of them without charge or trial. While there have been efforts to release or transfer detainees, the process has been slow and fraught with legal, political, and logistical challenges. The question of whether Guantanamo Bay will ever be fully closed remains a matter of intense debate, with many arguing that it is time for the United States to move beyond the legacy of Guantanamo Bay and ensure that future counter-terrorism efforts comply with both national and international legal standards. Political and legal challenges to closing Guantanamo. Efforts to close Guantanamo Bay have been repeatedly thwarted by a combination of legal, political, and ideological hurdles. The most notable attempt to close the facility came during the presidency of Barack Obama. Upon taking office in 2009, President Obama made closing Guantanamo Bay a central campaign promise, citing the facility as a stain on American values and a tool that undermined the global fight against terrorism. His administration sought to transfer detainees to other countries or prosecute them in civilian courts or military tribunals. However, these efforts faced substantial opposition from both political parties, particularly in Congress. Many lawmakers argued that closing the facility would send the wrong message to adversaries, and some were concerned about the potential for transferring dangerous individuals to U.S. soil. In addition, legislative actions such as the National Defense Authorization Act imposed restrictions on transferring detainees to the US or other countries, further complicating Obama's efforts. These legal and political obstacles made it nearly impossible for Obama to follow through with his promise to close Guantanamo before leaving office in 2017. President Donald Trump, who succeeded Obama, took a starkly different approach, signaling his intent to keep the detention facility open and expand its operations. In 2018, Trump signed an executive order to keep Guantanamo open, stating that "we are not closing it," and indicating that it would be a key part of the U.S. counter-terrorism strategy. Trump's administration also proposed increasing the number of detainees held at the facility, while further emphasizing the idea of indefinite detention for suspected terrorists. President Joe Biden, who took office in 2021, has expressed an interest in closing Guantanamo, but has faced significant challenges in doing so. His administration has indicated that it aims to reduce the number of detainees and transfer more prisoners, yet the process has been slow-moving due to bureaucratic hurdles and political resistance. The closure of the prison would likely require both diplomatic negotiations with countries willing to accept detainees and legal reform to ensure that the remaining detainees have access to fair trials or a just release process. Despite these challenges, the conversation around Guantanamo Bay continues to evolve, as more voices call for accountability and the closure of the facility. Human rights organizations, legal advocates, and former detainees continue to press for justice and for the U.S. to live up to its ideals of due process and human rights. The psychological and human cost of Guantanamo Bay. One of the most troubling aspects of Guantanamo Bay has been the psychological and human toll it has taken on detainees, many of whom were held for years without trial. The effects of long-term detention in isolation, harsh interrogation techniques, and the uncertainty of never knowing when or if one will be released have been devastating. Several detainees who were released from Guantanamo have spoken about the psychological damage they sustained during their time there, with many reporting long-lasting mental health issues such as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, depression, and anxiety. The practice of indefinite detention, holding individuals without charge or trial for years, has raised serious concerns among legal scholars and human rights activists. Detainees at Guantanamo Bay were often denied basic legal rights, such as the right to a fair trial, access to a lawyer, or even knowledge of the evidence against them. The lack of transparency and accountability in the legal process, combined with the harsh conditions of detention, have contributed to a sense of hopelessness and despair for many detainees. The reports of torture and abuse that emerged from Guantanamo Bay also reflect the darker side of the war on terror. Despite the US government's assertions that such practices were necessary for national security, they have been widely condemned by international bodies such as the United Nations and the European Union, as well as human rights groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. The US government's justification for the use of so-called enhanced interrogation techniques was based on the claim that they were essential for obtaining crucial intelligence to prevent future attacks. However, many experts argue that such methods were not only ineffective but also led to false confessions, making them both ethically and legally indefensible. The release of detainees from Guantanamo Bay has sometimes resulted in difficulty reintegrating into society. Some of the detainees, who were held for years without being formally charged or convicted of a crime, have found it challenging to rebuild their lives in their home countries. Others, however, have managed to rebuild their lives and become vocal critics of the detention facility and the war on terror. These individuals, having experienced Guantanamo firsthand, have become powerful advocates for justice, fairness, and human rights. The broader implications of Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay's legacy goes beyond the immediate issue of detainees and their treatment. It stands as a symbol of the broader issues surrounding US foreign policy, the use of military force, and the erosion of civil liberties in the name of national security. The very existence of Guantanamo Bay raises questions about the balance between security and liberty, the role of the US in the global fight against terrorism, and how the country should treat individuals accused of terrorism. Guantanamo has also had a lasting impact on the relationship between the United States and the international community. Many nations, particularly in Europe and the Middle East, have condemned the detention facility as a violation of international human rights norms. Critics argue that by holding prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, the US not only violated the rights of the detainees but also damaged its credibility as a global leader in the promotion of democracy and human rights. At the same time, proponents of the detention center argue that Guantanamo is a necessary part of the fight against terrorism. They argue that it allows the US to detain dangerous individuals without the constraints of civilian courts or other judicial systems that may be hindered by bureaucratic or political considerations. The idea, from a national security standpoint, is that Guantanamo represents a necessary sacrifice to prevent future attacks and ensure that suspected terrorists do not re-enter the battlefield. However, this reasoning is increasingly coming under scrutiny. The nature of modern warfare, with its complex web of terrorist organizations and decentralized operations, suggests that military detention without trial may not be the most effective or ethical way to combat terrorism. Furthermore, the stigma and backlash associated with Guantanamo have led many to argue that the facility has become a symbol of failure rather than success in the war on terror. The future of Guantanamo Bay. The future of Guantanamo Bay remains uncertain, with the US government and international community divided over how to handle the facility and its detainees. While some believe that the detention center serves a vital national security function, many others argue that its continued existence is incompatible with the values of justice, fairness, and human rights that the United States espouses. The debate over Guantanamo Bay is part of a broader conversation about the role of the US in the post-9/11 world and how the country can reconcile its need for security with its commitment to upholding the rule of law. As of now, the fate of Guantanamo Bay remains unresolved, with efforts to close the detention facility facing significant challenges. In the coming years, it will be up to lawmakers, human rights advocates, and the American public to determine whether Guantanamo Bay will remain open as a symbol of the war on terror, or whether it will be closed as a legacy of a bygone era, one that reflects a commitment to justice, accountability, and the protection of fundamental human rights. In the end, the story of Guantanamo Bay is not just about a military base or a detention facility. It is a story about the complexities of modern warfare, the ethical dilemmas posed by the war on terror, and the enduring struggle to balance security with liberty. It is a chapter in history that continues to unfold, and its resolution will have profound implications for the future of US foreign policy, the global fight against terrorism, and the ongoing quest for justice in an increasingly complex world. If you like this video, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more videos.